The air tasted like ash and liberation. Min-seo's fingers wouldn't stop trembling as she stood in the courtyard of what had been called the comfort station. A word so grotesque in its gentleness that it made her want to scream every time she heard it. The American soldiers had arrived 3 hours ago, their uniforms dusty from the long march through the Philippine jungle, their faces young and confused as they kicked down doors and found rooms full of women who couldn't remember how to stand upright. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. She was 23 years old. She had been 15 when the Japanese military police came to her village in Gyeongsang province, promising factory work in Japan, promising money for her family, promising everything except the truth. 8 years. 8 years of her life had dissolved into the single moment where an American officer with kind eyes and broken Japanese was telling them they were free to go home. Free. The word hung in the humid air like something she couldn't quite grasp. Min-seo looked down at her hands. Thin, scarred, the nails bitten to the quick. These hands had once planted rice seedlings alongside her mother. These hands had once braided her younger sister's hair. These hands had once been her own. Beside her, Hana was crying. Not the silent tears they'd all learned to perfect over the years, but great heaving sobs that shook her entire frame. Hana was only 19 now, which meant she'd been taken at 11. 11 years old. Min-seo reached out and took her hand, squeezing it the way she'd done countless nights when the younger girl woke screaming from nightmares that were actually memories. "We can go home," Hana whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. They'd learned to be quiet. Silence was survival. Min-seo Uni, we can actually go home. But could they? Min-seo looked around the courtyard at the other women. 47 of them had been in this station when the Americans arrived. 47 out of how many hundreds? Thousands? She'd heard rumors of other stations scattered across the Pacific, across China, across Southeast Asia. Rooms full of Korean girls and women, their names replaced with numbers. Their bodies transformed into something the Japanese military classified as supplies. Across the courtyard, Ji-won sat perfectly still on a wooden crate, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Ji-won had stopped speaking 6 months ago. She'd been a teacher before, educated in Seoul, fluent in Japanese and English. Now she communicated only through the origami cranes she folded obsessively from any scrap of paper she could find. Min-seo had counted them once. 347 paper birds hidden throughout their shared room, tucked into corners and crevices like prayers. An American soldier approached. Not the officer, but a younger man with red hair and freckles who looked barely old enough to shave. He was carrying canteens of water and what looked like chocolate bars. His hands shook as he offered them, and Min-seo realized with a jolt that he was afraid. Afraid of them, or afraid for them. She couldn't tell which. "Ma'am," he said in English, then tried again in halting Japanese. "Water. Food. You need." Min-seo took the canteen but couldn't bring herself to reach for the chocolate. The last time a Japanese officer had given her food, it had come with expectations she still couldn't wash away. The soldier seemed to understand. He set the chocolate bars down on a nearby bench and backed away slowly, as if they were wounded animals that might bolt. Maybe they were. The officer who'd announced their liberation was talking to another group of women near the main building. His name was Lieutenant Morrison, and he kept removing his cap and running his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration or grief or helplessness that Min-seo recognized because she'd felt it herself every single day for 8 years. There was a translator with him now, a Japanese-American soldier who spoke Korean with an accent that reminded Min-seo of her grandmother. "They're arranging transport," the translator said, addressing all of them. "Ships will take you to processing centers. From there, you'll be able to return to Korea, to your homes, your families. Min-seo's chest constricted. Did her family even know she was alive? The last time she'd been allowed to send a letter home was 5 years ago, and even then, the Japanese censors had controlled every word. "I am well, working hard. Send my love." Nothing about where she really was. Nothing about what was being done to them every night. Her mother's face swam before her eyes, round and warm, always smelling of doenjang stew and fresh laundry. Her father with his calloused hands and gentle smile. Her sister, Su-jin, who would be 17 now. Would they recognize her? Would they want to? The shame hit her like a physical force, and she had to sit down. Hana sat beside her, still holding her hand. They didn't speak. After so many years of forced intimacy, forced violation, forced silence, they developed a language beyond words. Around them, other women were reacting in their own ways. Some were crying. Some were laughing with a hysteria that sounded like breaking glass. Some, like Ji-won, sat in absolute stillness, as if movement might shatter whatever fragile shell was keeping them intact. And some, Min-seo's heart broke as she watched. Some were returning to the rooms they'd been kept in, unable to comprehend that the doors were no longer locked. A Korean woman appeared in the courtyard entrance. She was older, perhaps 50, wearing a traditional hanbok that looked clean and pressed despite the chaos. Her eyes swept across the assembled women with a mixture of compassion and something else. Determination. Maybe. She spoke to Lieutenant Morrison briefly, then walked directly to where Min-seo and Hana sat. "My name is Park Yeonja," she said in Korean, her voice firm but kind. "I've been working with the Red Cross trying to locate and help Korean women caught in these situations. I'm here to make sure you get home safely. All of you." Min-seo looked up at her. "How did you know? How did you know to come here?" Yeonja's expression hardened. "Because there are hundreds of these stations. We've been mapping them, documenting them, making lists." She paused, then knelt down so she was at eye level with both young women. "What happened to you is not your fault. Do you understand me? None of it is your fault." The words should have brought comfort. Instead, they brought rage. 8 years of swallowing rage, of pushing it down deep where it couldn't get her killed, and now it was rising like flood water. Min-seo's hands clenched into fists. "They took me from my home," she said, her voice low and shaking. "They told my parents I'd be making money for the family. They put me on a train with 40 other girls. The youngest was 12 years old. 12. And when we arrived here," her voice broke. "When we arrived, they gave us numbers. I was number 17. For 8 years, I've been number 17. Hana squeezed her hand tighter. "Number 23, she whispered. "I was number 23. Yeonja's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained steady. "Then we write down your real names. We document everything. Because someday, maybe not today, maybe not for years, but someday there will be justice. There will be truth." Min-seo wanted to believe her, but justice seemed like such a small, insufficient word for what had been taken from them. The ship that would take them back to Korea wouldn't arrive for 3 days. 3 days of waiting in a temporary camp the Americans had set up, where they slept in tents that smelled like canvas and possibility, where they ate rice balls and canned vegetables, where they were given clean clothes and soap and treated with a careful gentleness that made Min-seo's skin crawl because she'd forgotten what kindness without strings attached felt like. At night, she lay awake and forced herself to remember who she'd been before. Her name was Kim Min-seo. She was born in a small village outside Daegu in 1921, the eldest of 3 children. Her father was a farmer who also did carpentry in the winter months, creating beautiful furniture with his patient hands. Her mother kept a garden that was the envy of all their neighbors, growing vegetables and medicinal herbs that she shared freely with anyone who needed them. Min-seo had been bright. Everyone said so. She'd learned to read quickly, devouring every book she could find. Her teacher, Kim Min-seo, had told her parents she should continue her education, maybe even go to one of the girls' schools in the city. But there was no money for that, not with 3 children to feed and her father's bad knee that made farming harder each year. So instead, she'd helped. She'd worked in the fields, planted and harvested, carried water, mended clothes, watched her younger siblings. And she'd been happy. She tried to hold on to that, the memory of being happy, of laughing with Su-jin as they chased fireflies on summer evenings, of her little brother, Tae-hyun, falling asleep in her lap while she told him stories, of the boy from the next village, Lee Jin-ho, who'd started finding excuses to visit their farm, who'd looked at her like she was something precious. She'd been 15 when the military police came. Spring of 1936. She remembered the date because it had been just after her mother's birthday. They'd come in a truck, wearing crisp uniforms, speaking Japanese that her father barely understood. They'd had papers, official documents with stamps and seals. They'd talked about the war effort, about duty to the emperor, about opportunities for young Korean women to serve and earn wages. Her father had been reluctant, but they'd been persuasive, these men in uniforms. They'd promised good wages, money that could pay off the family's debts, money that could send Taehyun to school. And there were other girls from the village going too. Surely it would be safe if there were others? Min-seo had wanted to go. She was ashamed of that now, but it was true. She'd wanted to see beyond the village, wanted to earn money for her family, wanted to be useful in a bigger way. Her mother had cried, but her father had signed the papers. And Min-seo had packed a small bag with her few possessions. A spare dress, a photograph of her family, a small wooden carving of a bird that her father had made for her when she was 7. She still had the bird. Somehow, through everything, she'd managed to keep it. It was in her pocket now, the wood worn smooth from 8 years of anxious handling. She took it out sometimes, traced its wings, tried to remember her father's hands creating something beautiful just because his daughter had asked. The train ride had been long. 42 girls, all Korean, all between 12 and 18 years old. They'd been excited at first, chattering and sharing food, imagining what their new jobs would be like. The recruiters had mentioned factory work, sewing, maybe nursing, honorable work supporting the Japanese Empire. The first sign that something was wrong came when they didn't stop in any Japanese city. The train kept going through the countryside, eventually to a port where they were loaded onto a ship. Still, they'd told themselves stories. Maybe the factories were overseas. Maybe they'd be working in Manchuria or Taiwan. The ship had taken them to the Philippines, to this island, to this building where they were divided into rooms, given numbers instead of names, and told exactly what their real jobs would be. Min-seo could still remember the face of the woman who'd explained it to them. A Japanese woman, middle-aged, with cold eyes and a clipboard. "You will service the Imperial Japanese Army?" she'd said in Japanese, which one of the older Korean girls had translated with a trembling voice. "You will do as you're told. Resistance will be punished. Disobedience will be punished. You belong to the emperor now." 3 girls had tried to run that first night. They'd been caught, beaten in front of the others, then taken away. Min-seo never saw them again. Later, she heard rumors. One had been shot. One had been sent to an even worse station. One had died from her injuries. The message was clear. There was no escape. The first time an officer came to her room, Min-seo had fought. She'd screamed and scratched and kicked. It hadn't mattered. He was bigger, stronger, trained in combat. And when he was finished, the cold-eyed woman had come in and told her that if she fought again, they'd punish not her, but one of the other girls. They'd punish young Hana, who was only 11 and cried for her mother every night. So Min-seo stopped fighting. She learned to leave her body, to go somewhere else in her mind while the soldiers used her. She learned to be number 17, to respond when called, to line up when ordered, to submit and survive. But at night, in the brief hours when they were left alone, she'd take out the wooden bird and remember being Kim Min-seo, daughter, sister, a girl who'd once caught fireflies and dreamed of learning to read better, a girl who'd had a future. Now, lying in a tent in the American camp, she held the bird and tried to imagine going home. What would she tell her parents? How could she explain where she'd been, what had happened to her? Would Jin-ho still be waiting? Would her sister look at her with horror instead of love? Beside her, Hana whimpered in her sleep. Min-seo reached over and touched her shoulder gently, the way she'd done hundreds of times. Hana quieted. They'd become something like family here, the women who'd survived together. Min-seo had taken care of Hana from that first day, protecting her as much as she could, sharing food, holding her when she cried. And there were others. Ji-won, the silent teacher with her paper cranes. Myung-ja, who'd been a singer before and sometimes hummed folk songs to soothe them. Young-hee, who'd learned Japanese and served as a translator. trying to negotiate small mercies from the officers. Suk-ja, who tried to kill herself 3 times and each time had been saved by the other women who refused to let her go. They were sisters in suffering. But would that bond last once they returned home? Or would shame and silence scatter them like seeds? In the morning, Park Yeonja came to the tent with news. She had notebooks now, and she was interviewing each woman, writing down their stories. For the record, she explained. So there's documentation. So no one can deny this happened. Min-seo sat down with her and began to talk. She told her real name, her village, her family's names, the date she was taken, the lies she was told, the journey to the Philippines, the station, the number they gave her. Yeonja wrote it all down, her hands steady even as tears rolled down her cheeks. How many? Min-seo asked when she was finished. How many women like us? Yeonja looked up from her notebook. We don't know yet. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. Across Korea. Across all the occupied territories. She paused. The Japanese military called it a comfort system. They organized it, regulated it, moved women around like supplies. This wasn't random violence. It was policy. The rage came back hot and fierce. Will anyone pay for this? Will there be trials? I don't know, Yeonja admitted. The Americans are focused on the major war criminals, generals, politicians. Whether they'll care about what happened to Korean women. She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Min-seo thought about that for the rest of the day. The idea that what had been done to them might not matter to the victors. That their suffering might be a footnote or worse, forgotten entirely. That night, she gathered with some of the other women around a small fire. Lieutenant Morrison had given them permission to cook rice the Korean way, and the smell of it, proper rice, not the thin gruel they'd been fed for years, made several women cry. What will you do? Myungja asked quietly. When we get home. No one answered immediately. The question was too big, too complicated. Finally, Young-hee spoke. I'll tell the truth, she said. I'll tell everyone what happened. I'll make sure people know. They won't want to hear it, Suk-ja said bitterly. We'll be shameful, dirty, ruined women. Then we change what shame means. Min-seo heard herself say. We tell our stories until people listen. Until they understand that this wasn't our shame. It was theirs. The women looked at her, hope and doubt warring on their faces. Ji-won, who hadn't spoken in 6 months, carefully unfolded one of her paper cranes. Inside, written in tiny characters, was a name. Her real name that she'd been before she was a number. She looked at Min-seo and, for the first time in half a year, she spoke. Kim Ji-won, she said, her voice rusty but clear. My name is Kim Ji-won. I was a teacher. I had students who loved me. And I'm going home. The ship was an American military transport vessel, gray and utilitarian. Nothing like the passenger ships Min-seo had imagined in those rare moments when she'd let herself dream of escape. The sailors were young and awkward around the Korean women, unsure how to interact with people who were simultaneously rescued and broken, victims and survivors. Park Yeonja had arranged for the women to have their own section of the ship, away from the male soldiers. There were bunks with actual mattresses, blankets that smelled of soap instead of sweat and despair, and a small galley where they could prepare Korean food with supplies Yeonja had somehow procured. Rice, kimchi, doenjang, the smells of home. 47 women boarded that ship, but they were joined by others at different ports, women rescued from other comfort stations across the Philippines. By the time they set sail for Korea, there were 83 of them, ranging in age from 15 to 35, united by trauma and uncertainty. Min-seo stood at the rail as the ship pulled away from the dock, watching the island disappear into the distance. 8 years of her life, condensed into a shrinking speck of land. She felt nothing, or everything. She couldn't tell the difference anymore. Good riddance, Hana said beside her. The younger woman had barely left Min-seo's side since the liberation. I hope it sinks into the ocean. I hope it disappears completely. It won't, Ji-won said quietly, joining them. She was speaking more now, short sentences that emerged like birds released from cages. There will be other stations. Other women still trapped. This isn't over. The thought haunted Min-seo. How many women were still out there in comfort stations across China, Korea, Southeast Asia? How many were waiting for liberation that might never come? The war was over. Everyone kept saying that. But war's ending didn't erase its crimes. The journey would take 5 days. 5 days of living in a strange liminal space between captivity and freedom, between the past they were leaving and the future they couldn't quite imagine. Park Yunja organized them. She'd been doing this work for years, apparently, traveling to comfort stations, documenting testimonies, fighting with military bureaucracies to secure transportation and supplies for survivors. She'd been a teacher before the war, educated and determined, and she refused to let these women become invisible. On the second day at sea, she gathered them all in the largest space available and told them what to expect. Korea is in chaos right now, she explained, her voice carrying across the room. The Japanese surrender was sudden. The Americans and Soviets have divided the country at the 38th parallel. In the south, there's an American military government. In the north, Soviet forces. Nobody knows what comes next. What about our families? One woman asked. Will they know we're coming? Yunja's expression was sympathetic but honest. I've sent word through Red Cross channels, but communication is difficult. Many families displaced. Some villages destroyed during the occupation. Some of you may return to find your families moved or... She paused. We have to prepare for all possibilities. The reality settled over them like snow. They might go home to find no home waiting. Min-seo thought of her village, tried to remember if it had been near any strategic locations, anything that might have made it a target. She'd heard stories of villages burned, populations scattered, entire communities erased. What if her parents were dead? What if Su-jin had been taken to a comfort station too? What if Taehyun had been conscripted into the Japanese military and died in some jungle or on some beach? The possibilities multiplied in her mind, each one worse than the last. That night, unable to sleep, Min-seo went up on deck. The ocean stretched in all directions, dark and infinite. She wasn't alone. Several other women were there too, drawn by insomnia or nightmares or the simple need for space. One of them was a woman Min-seo hadn't spoken to much. She looked older, maybe 30, with gray streaking her hair despite her age. She was standing at the rail, staring at the water with an intensity that made Min-seo nervous. Don't, Min-seo said quietly, moving closer. Please don't. The woman looked at her, and her laugh was bitter. You think I'm going to jump? After surviving this long? She turned back to the ocean. I'm just trying to figure out how to explain to my husband that I'm alive. If he's still my husband. If he even wants me back. You were married? 3 months. The woman's voice was flat. 3 months married when they took me. It was 1938. 7 years ago. I was pregnant. She touched her stomach, a reflexive gesture. They beat it out of me in the first week. Said I'd be no use if I was carrying a child. Min-seo had no words. She'd heard similar stories, variations on the same theme of brutality and loss. But each one still had the power to shock, to wound. My name is Choi Eun-hee, the woman continued. I keep saying it to myself. Choi Eun-hee. Like maybe if I say it enough, I'll remember how to be her again. The girl who got married. The woman who was going to have a baby. But I look at my hands and I see number 31. I close my eyes and I see their faces. How do I go back to being someone's wife when I don't even know who I am anymore? Maybe we figure it out together, Min-seo offered. All of us. Eun-hee looked at her, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition, solidarity, the understanding of shared damage. Maybe, she said. Or maybe we're all just pretending we can be whole again when we know we're irreparably broken. The conversation stayed with Min-seo. Over the next few days, as the ship cut through the water toward Korea, she found herself talking to more of the women. Really talking, not just the survival-based communication they'd developed in captivity. She learned that Myungja, the singer, had been training for the traditional court music before she was taken. Her voice had been considered exceptional. Now, she said, she could barely stand to hear herself sing. Music reminded her of the nights when they'd been forced to entertain officers before the real work began. She learned that Suk-ja had a son, 4 years old when she was taken, which meant he'd be 12 now. She'd been told he was dead, killed in a bombing, but she didn't believe it. She couldn't afford to believe it because then what had she survived for? She learned that young Hee had taught herself Japanese by listening to the officers, picking up words and phrases, building a vocabulary from fragments. She'd used it to negotiate small mercies, an extra ration, permission to take another girl to the doctor, a reduction in the number of men they had to service in a night. She'd saved lives with her language skills, but now she hated every Japanese word she knew. And she learned that almost all of them were terrified of going home. Terrified of being rejected, of being blamed, of being reduced to their trauma in the eyes of the people who'd once loved them. On the 4th day, Park Yeon-ja organized a meeting. She had papers, forms that needed to be filled out for the military government's records. Basic information: name, age, hometown, circumstances of abduction, length of captivity. This is important, she told them. This documentation may be the only proof of what happened to you. The Japanese are already destroying records, burning documents. We need your testimonies preserved. But many women were reluctant. What if our families find out? One asked. What if people in our villages learn what happened? The shame isn't yours to carry, Yeon-ja said firmly. But I understand your fear. These documents will be kept confidential, used only for official purposes. You don't have to share your stories with anyone you don't choose to tell. Min-seo filled out her form. Writing her real name felt strange, like putting on clothes that no longer fit. Kim Min-seo, born 1921, taken from Gyeongsang Province, 1936. Held in Comfort Station, Philippines, 1936 to 1945. The facts were simple. The reality was anything but. As she wrote, she noticed Ji-won beside her, filling out her own form with careful precision. The teacher's handwriting was beautiful, each character perfectly formed. When she finished, she set down the pen and looked at Min-seo. I'm going to write a book, Ji-won said. About this, about all of it. Not now, I'm not ready now, but someday, someone needs to remember. Someone needs to tell the truth. They won't want to hear it, Min-seo said, echoing Suk-ja's earlier words. I know, but I'll write it anyway. For us, for the women who didn't survive, for the girls who might be taken in future wars if we don't make people understand what this kind of violence does. Ji-won's eyes were fierce. You can't heal a wound you won't acknowledge exists. That night, the ship entered Korean waters. In the morning, they would dock at Busan. In the morning, they would step back onto the soil they'd been stolen from. In the morning, everything would become real. Min-seo couldn't sleep. None of them could. They gathered in their section of the ship, 83 women who'd been through hell together, and they talked about what came next. Some had families to return to or hoped they did. Some had nowhere to go, their homes destroyed or their families scattered. Park Yeon-ja promised to help those women, to find them housing and work, to make sure they weren't abandoned. We stay together, Hana said suddenly. The teenager looked around at all the faces. Some of us, those who want to, we stay together and we help each other. We're sisters now, whether we want to be or not. There were nods, murmurs of agreement. The bonds forged in trauma might be painful, but they were also strong. These women understood each other in ways no one else could. Myung-ja began to hum, then sing, a traditional folk song about longing for home, about journeys and returns. Her voice was tentative at first, rusty from disuse and damaged by trauma. But it strengthened as she sang, and other women joined in, their voices blending in harmony that was imperfect and heartbreaking and beautiful. Min-seo sang too, the words coming back to her from childhood. Her mother had sung this song while working in the garden. The memory hurt and healed simultaneously. When the song ended, there was silence. Then Eun-hee spoke. No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter who's waiting or not waiting, we survived. They tried to destroy us and we survived. That means something. It means everything, Ji-won agreed. Min-seo took out her wooden bird, held it up so the others could see. My father made this for me when I was 7. I've kept it all these years. It's proof that I was someone before I was number 17. Tomorrow I go back to being that someone. Kim Min-seo, daughter of Kim Young-chul and Lee Hae-won, sister to Kim Su-jin and Kim Tae-hyun. A person with a history that's bigger than what was done to me. Other women began sharing their own talismans. A photograph, a letter, a piece of jewelry, a scrap of cloth. Physical proof of their previous lives, their previous selves. They passed them around, careful and reverent, holding each other's memories with gentle hands. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As dawn broke over the Korean coast, they stood on deck together and watched their homeland emerge from the mist. The mountains, the shoreline, the colors they dreamed about for years. We're home, Hana whispered, gripping Min-seo's hand so tightly it hurt. But were they? Home implied safety, belonging, acceptance. What awaited them might be none of those things. The ship docked at Busan in mid-morning. The port was chaotic. American military personnel everywhere. Korean civilians searching for information about displaced relatives. Aid workers trying to organize relief efforts. Everything was noise and confusion and desperate humanity. Park Yun-ja led them down the gangplank in a group, keeping them together. She'd arranged temporary housing at a church that was being used as a shelter for displaced people. From there, she'd help each woman make contact with their families or find alternative accommodations. Min-seo's feet touched Korean soil for the first time in 8 years. She knelt down, pressed her palms to the ground, and allowed herself to cry. Around her, other women did the same. They were home, damaged, traumatized, uncertain of their future, but home. An American soldier approached Park Yun-ja with a clipboard, speaking through a translator. There were forms, procedures, protocols. The machinery of bureaucracy grinding on, indifferent to emotion. While Yun-ja dealt with officialdom, the women waited. They sat on their bags. Most of them had almost nothing beyond the clothes they wore, and looked around at a Korea that was both familiar and foreign. The Japanese occupation was over, but its scars were everywhere. Buildings with Japanese signage being torn down. American military vehicles on roads they remembered as dirt paths. The weight of change and uncertainty. A young Korean man approached, holding a camera. He was dressed in Western clothes, clearly educated. "Excuse me," he said in Korean. "I'm a reporter with the Seoul Daily News. I'd like to do a story about your return. About what you experienced." The women went silent, suspicious, wary. Park Yun-ja stepped between them and the reporter. "These women have been through enough. They deserve privacy, not exploitation." "I'm not trying to exploit anyone," the reporter protested. "But people need to know what happened. The Japanese comfort system, what they did to Korean women, it needs to be documented, publicized." "They'll be judged," one woman said bitterly. "You'll write about us and people will judge us." The reporter looked genuinely distressed. "That's not my intention. I want to honor your suffering, to make sure people understand this was a war crime." "Come back in a month," Park Yun-ja told him firmly. "Give them time to reunite with families, to adjust. Then, if any of them want to speak to you, I'll arrange it. But not today." The reporter left, but Min-seo knew he wouldn't be the last. Their story was sensational, dramatic, the kind of thing that would sell newspapers. But they weren't stories. They were people. And they'd already been used enough. The church shelter in Busan was crowded and cold. But it was safe. Park Yun-ja had secured space for the 83 women in what had been the church hall. They slept on mats on the floor, but there were blankets and hot food and, most importantly, freedom. Min-seo spent the first night alternating between sleep and panic. Every time she closed her eyes, she expected to open them in the station, to hear footsteps approaching, to feel hands on her body. It took hours to convince herself she was really free, really in Korea, really safe. In the morning, Park Yun-ja began the process of connecting women with their families. She'd compiled a list of names and last known addresses. Korean Red Cross volunteers were working to locate relatives, sending messengers to villages, posting notices in public places. Kim Min-seo, Yeonja called out on the third day. "I have news about your family." Min-seo's heart stopped. She stood on trembling legs and followed Yeonja to a quieter corner of the hall. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, which terrified her. "Your parents are alive," Yeonja said, and Min-seo nearly collapsed with relief. "They're still in your village. Your father's health isn't good. He was injured during a forced labor conscription, but he's alive. Your mother as well. And my siblings?" Yeonja hesitated. "Your brother, Tae-hyun, was conscripted into the Japanese military in 1943. He was killed in action in Burma." "I'm sorry." The news hit like a physical blow. Tae-hyun. Baby Tae-hyun with his gap-toothed smile and endless energy. He'd been only 8 years old when she was taken. He'd have been 17 when he was conscripted. Barely more than a child. And they'd sent him to die in a war that wasn't even Korea's. "My sister," Min-seo managed to ask. "Su-jin is alive. There's been a difficulty." Yeonja's expression was pained. "She was taken to a comfort station as, your sister Su-jin is alive. There's been a difficulty." Yeonja's expression was pained. "She was taken to a comfort station as well. In 1942. She was only 14. The world tilted. Min-seo couldn't breathe. Su-jin, her baby sister, the girl whose hair she used to braid, who used to follow her everywhere, who'd cried when Min-seo left for what they thought would be factory work. "Where is she?" Min-seo's voice was barely a whisper. "She's back in the village. She returned 6 months ago." "But Min-seo," Yeonja gripped her hand. "She's not well. Physically, yes. But mentally. She hasn't spoken since she came home. Just like Ji-won had been. Silence as a refuge from unbearable memory." "I need to go to her," Min-seo said. "Now. Today." Yeonja nodded. "I've arranged transport. A truck leaves tomorrow morning for Gyeongsang province. You'll be home by evening." That night, Min-seo told Hana and the others about Su-jin. They held her while she cried. Not the silent tears of captivity, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place she'd kept locked away for 8 years. "We'll help her," Ji-won said firmly. "The way we helped each other. Your sister isn't alone anymore." The truck ride took all day, bumping along roads damaged by war and neglect. Min-seo sat in the back with 5 other women who were also returning to Gyeongsang province, clutching her wooden bird so tightly it left imprints on her palm. When they reached her village, it was late afternoon. The place looked smaller than she remembered, shabbier. Many houses had been damaged or rebuilt poorly. Japanese signs were being torn down, replaced with hastily painted Korean characters. She walked through streets she'd known her entire childhood, and people stared. Some recognized her. She could see it in their eyes, but they turned away quickly, uncomfortable. Shameful woman returning. Ruined girl coming home. Her family's house stood at the end of the lane, looking weathered but intact. Min-seo's legs felt like water. What if her parents rejected her? What if they blamed her for Su-jin's fate? If Min-seo hadn't gone first, maybe they wouldn't have let Su-jin be taken too. The door opened before she could knock. Her mother stood there, older and grayer than Min-seo remembered, her face lined with years of worry and grief. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then her mother whispered, "Min-seoya," and pulled her into an embrace so fierce it hurt. My daughter came home." Min-seo collapsed into her mother's arms and wept. Her father appeared, limping badly from his injury, tears streaming down his weathered face. They held her between them, and for the first time in 8 years, Min-seo felt like a person instead of a number. "Su-jin," Min-seo finally managed to say. "Where is she?" Her mother's face clouded. "In her room. She doesn't come out much." Min-seo found her sister sitting by the window, staring at nothing. Su-jin was 17 now, but she looked ancient. Thin, hollow-eyed, her hands constantly moving as if washing away invisible stains. Su-jin, ah, Min-seo said softly, kneeling beside her. It's me, Uni. Su-jin's eyes flickered toward her, and something, recognition, maybe, passed across her face. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Min-seo took her sister's restless hands in her own. I know, she whispered. I know what happened to you. It happened to me too. And I'm here now. We survived. Both of us survived. For the first time in 6 months, Su-jin made a sound, a small, broken whimper. Then she leaned forward and pressed her forehead against Min-seo's shoulder. The sisters sat like that as the sun set, holding each other the way they'd once held each other as children. Except now they were bound by something far darker than shared childhood memories. That evening, Min-seo's parents wanted to know everything. But Min-seo couldn't tell them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. How could she explain to her father what men had done to his daughters? How could she tell her mother about the years of systematic rape, the beatings, the dehumanization? We were taken for labor, she said instead, the lie bitter on her tongue. It was hard. But we're home now. Her mother wasn't fooled. Min-seo could see it in her eyes. The understanding, the grief, the guilt. But her mother didn't press. Some truths were too terrible to speak aloud. Over the following weeks, Min-seo worked to rebuild something like a life. She helped in her mother's garden, finding unexpected peace in the familiar rhythm of planting and weeding. She sat with Su-jin every day, talking to her even when her sister didn't respond, telling her stories, singing the folk songs their mother had taught them. Slowly, incrementally, Su-jin began to come back. First, she started making eye contact. Then she began eating without being coaxed. Finally, 3 weeks after Min-seo's return, she spoke. I thought you were dead, Su-jin whispered, her voice rough from disuse. They told me you were dead. I thought the same about you, Min-seo replied. But we're both alive. We're both here. Park Yunja visited monthly, checking on them, bringing news of the other women. Some had found acceptance at home. Others had been rejected, forced to start new lives in cities where no one knew their shame. Hana had stayed in Busan, working at a shelter for displaced women. Ji-won was teaching again in Seoul, and she'd started writing her book. The reporter from Seoul came too, asking again for their stories. This time, Min-seo agreed to speak with him, not for publication with her name, but to add her testimony to the growing record of Japanese war crimes. Su-jin listened as Min-seo talked, and later that night, she told Min-seo she wanted to testify too. So people know, Su-jin said quietly. So it's not forgotten. The village never fully accepted them. There were whispers, sidelong glances, mothers who wouldn't let their sons near the comfort women who'd returned. But Min-seo and Su-jin had each other. They had their parents' love, and they had their determination to survive with dignity. Years later, when historians and activists would ask comfort women to come forward, to testify publicly about what had been done to them, Min-seo would be among the first to speak. She would stand before cameras and governments and tell the truth about being number 17, about the systematic sexual slavery of Korean women, about the crime that Japan wanted to forget. She would do it for Hana and Ji-won and all the women who'd survived alongside her. She would do it for Su-jin, who'd found her voice again. She would do it for her brother Taehyun, dead in Burma. She would do it for the thousands of women who didn't survive, whose stories were buried in unmarked graves across Asia. But on that first night home, sitting with her sister under the stars they'd both thought they'd never see again, Min-seo simply held the wooden bird her father had carved and whispered, "We're home. We're damaged, but we're home. And we're going to survive this too." And they did.